Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. Glad you're here today. Good morning, Lorraine, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Oh, thank you so much, Mary. I'm so happy to be here with you.
I am delighted to be here with you as well, and I found you and your work as I was reading. I think it was an article on mediate.com. You've got wonderful articles and you are really engaged in trying to help people have better work environments and therefore better and more fulfilling lives. And so I would like to hear all about you, but I want to start with the first job you ever had as a young person.
Oh, the first job I ever had was as a sales associate at a children's clothing boutique in a shopping complex. And I was making minimum wage, and I was the youngest one there, and I learned a lot.
So tell us about that experience.
Um, I actually I mean, it was only for a little time, and then I switched to working at it was called Bullock's Department Store in Southern California, and I floated all over. I helped dress the models, I worked in different departments, then I worked in the fine jewelry department because it was really complicated with the keys and everything, and they liked having college girls there, because, they could remember all the different key things and the locking up and everything, and actually, it was an interesting experience in talking to my coworkers and, I was more focused on education, so it was my first real experience besides babysitting and things of having a taste of what it was like to be in the work world, which certainly made me wanna keep getting an education, and I actually had something really dramatic happened there where there was a robbery right in front of me where they were taking these expensive hats across the way, and I I was so foolish. I chased after them and wrote down the license plate number, and they caught one of them, and then I had to testify in court. So that was, eh, and then they laid me off to hire this, um, man in his 80s who couldn't use the keys at all, but he looked like a jeweler, and I, at the time, didn't understand at all why they would want him rather than me. Now I do.
Whoa, what some interesting first jobs. So both in retail. Retail is, we think about you working with the public. So retail or food is such an interesting introduction because we've got our family of origin and our experiences, and then we're out with everybody, right? And
Yes.
wow, what an experience
Yeah,
to
and I met a couple of movie stars, nobody you would have heard of now because it was so long ago, but, people who were in Mission Impossible or The Bionic Man, and I thought, "Where do I know these? Why do they look familiar?" And then I met the guy who played Sergeant Joe Friday. Uh,
that Southern California. You never know who's
yeah,
going to walk in a shop. Absolutely.
right.
Do you remember anything from those first jobs about management? How you were treated as an employee?
Um I mean, they weren't I wasn't treated terribly. The one in the fine jewelry, it was like Peyton Place. There were 2 women who were both Latina. One was from an upper class family who had gone to private schools, and one of them was more of like a street fighter kind. Both gorgeous, and they hated each other and wouldn't talk Spanish to each other at all. And the street fighter kind of gal, she was tall and dramatic with black hair and flashing eyes, a little bit stereotypic, I guess, of what the movies would say about. And the other woman had red hair and, very patrician looking. And she had a sort of affair with the manager, the street fighter gal. And I saw them once in the back room, and she had her leg wrapped around his waist, and he had his, and I was like, "What's going on?"
Oh my word, what an introduction to the world of work from
And
intrigue
they were,
and
and the other thing, it was people who came to the fine jewelry department were mostly rich. A lot of them were. And the arrogance which, you know, I remember one woman looking at things and asking me, and then she looked at me and said, "I didn't even see you were a person."
Wow.
Yeah.
So
So
what
that
did
was sort of interesting too.
absolutely. What did you go to college for?
I I went to UCLA and I studied psychology and political science, thinking that, well, actually I started in English, and at that time they really didn't teach people how to write. I got a C on my first essay in English composition and I was horrified. Um, because, I'd always gotten A's in English in high school, and so I switched majors on the spot. I couldn't bear any I had no concept of that it was something I could learn to do better, and that was okay. So I switched to, psychology and political science, which was actually really they were both really interesting, and I learned a lot, and then I went back to English later.
So after undergraduate, you went to graduate school? Is
Not
that
right
correct?
away. I actually took some time off. I worked at a battered women's shelter. I worked at a co-op grocery store. I did different things. And when I was at the battered women's shelter, I came across this flyer. It was called Women Healing and Social Change in Mexico. So I went to Mexico and studied Spanish and liberation theology and feminism in Mexico. And it was totally mind-blowing about different cultures and how people communicate. And so when I came back, I didn't wanna I had been thinking of going to law school or becoming a psychologist, and I really became fascinated with cultural differences, and I went back to school to study how to teach English as a second language and linguistics.
And so then you worked at a university teaching
I
ESL, is that correct?
Yeah, first I was a what's called a freeway flyer, where you have, it's like EduBiz, you have no rights, very few benefits, and I drove all around the Bay Area, which is where I lived at that time. I worked at about 8 different colleges total, I think, piecing together a living from teaching at different schools, trying to get a full-time job, and then I finally landed one, and I had to relocate, but at that point, I was willing to do that to get the golden goal of tenure.
I think we could do a whole podcast on the ethics of uh, adjunct teaching and how adjuncts are treated
Oh,
and what is expected of them. But setting that aside, so you got the job of your dreams, and
so I thought,
so you
yes,
thought,
and I was so I mean, I was like in a honeymoon, I was in bliss that I was full-time, and I actually got hired to run the small English as a second language department, so I was kind of thrown into a management situation right away as well, and, I think that lasted about a month. And then I started realizing, as the head of the criminal justice department told me at that time, this place was in a 50s time warp, and I was gonna run into a lot of stuff and just be warned. And he was absolutely right. They hired me to expand and strengthen the ESL department, and then when I started making the schedules for the next semester, they wouldn't give me classroom space, and I had to fight for it. It was very much a pay lip service to what we're supposed to be doing, but not doing it. And there was a big attitude that women should not be leaders that I uncovered. And there was anti-Semitism and homophobia, and you name it. They treated my students like second-class citizens because they were immigrants. And I did a lot to fight for my students and to be a good teacher and to hire good adjuncts and treat them as well as I possibly could, given that I didn't have control over payroll. But yeah, it was, I was there a total of 20 years
oh my
actually. And
goodness,
by the time I left, I had PTSD really
yeah.
severely, and I escaped. I finally just figured out a way to get out of there.
Mhm.
escape because it was relentless, the lies they told about me and to me. For example, we got funding for people who were, first-time college students and underserved communities to create a language lab. And I did so much work. I put together a proposal. I did all this research. I went and visited places. I learned how to set up the lab physically once we got, what configuration would work. I trained myself in the software and everything. And then the lab was completely taken away from the ESL department and used as a language lab. And I never got credit for the work I'd done, and my students didn't get the benefits ultimately. That was one of endless maddening things. And it wasn't just to me. I wasn't just the only one, but it was definitely bullying and mobbing. And yeah. So
I'm sorry you experienced that. That sounds awful. When you were describing originally what the environment was like, I'm like, oh, I hope you got out of there in a couple of months. And then you said 20 years with the word escape. And that's how many people feel at work, or some
yeah.
people feel that at work, that they are in toxic environments. And of course, we know the reason that people stay in a toxic environment is because they feel trapped.
It was so hard to walk away from tenure, and it
Yeah.
wasn't horrible the whole time. I mean, I'm not a
Right.
total masochist. I loved my students. I loved actually running the department. It was fun. It used my brain. And they didn't care what I taught as long as I was teaching reading, writing, oral communication skills. So I taught my students all kinds of cool stuff like environmental action and media literacy and gender roles and transgender. I did these amazing fun things. I looked over my materials once when I had left and was finally um, gonna get rid of them because I knew I would never teach ESL again. And I thought, damn, you were good. Yeah, so there were good things. I learned a lot and about managing up and managing down, and I didn't realize until I had switched careers what an excellent job I'd done with no formal training in that. But the last few years got worse and worse. I was a wreck. It was just like being assaulted every
Mhm.
day when I went in there, and I withdrew from any leadership positions because it was too much. And, I one of the horrible things that happened that it turned out to be good was um, I was forced to participate in a so-called mediation run by someone who knew almost nothing. An HR person, and there's many wonderful HR people, but this one was not. And she had taken like probably a 2-hour training on mediation or something, and it was everybody attack Lorraine. That's what
Mhm.
it was, and it was horrible. But out of that, I thought, this can't be what a mediation is. This this can't be the way you resolve conflict in a good world. And so I actually, through serendipity, found a program in conflict management at my local university. And I went back to school and fell in love with the field and as I say, escaped from that environment and started my own business.
Well, it's so wonderful that there's a silver lining, but you talked about PTSD. I mean, this is the thing about toxic work environments, is that when we leave, it's not like we are turning the page and starting over, as if all of that, the way that we've been treated, the way we've been misunderstood and belittled and looked over, and all of the things that you experienced and that people experience in these environments, they have this way of sticking with us if we don't deal with them. And what
Yes.
happens to most people is they leave an environment because they can't take it anymore, but they still need to pay their rent, and so they go right back to work, and it's the working wounded, from one place to another.
Yes.
Even if the next place is good, they're still, reeling from those experiences.
Absolutely, and one of the things that I tell people when I teach about this and when I've coached people is that time alone does not heal PTSD. And I actually was in therapy with a trauma-informed therapist when I was still there, and she did EMDR work with me and all these things. And then I had to continue after I had left because the first job I had post this horrible place was at the university, still teaching ESL. It was like a summer program, and they hired me, and I started being bullied and mobbed there too. And I
Mhm.
could tell that so much of it was me, that I was kind of in victim mode, and I could see it, but I couldn't stop it. And it was a really bad experience.
Mm.
It was, well, it was a setup anyway, the way they wanted me to teach and everything, but still, I was just shaking still, I think, and I couldn't, I couldn't cope with it, and so I went back and I said, "I need more help." And I worked with a somatic therapist to just get it out of my cells, and then for a while, whenever I wanted to teach about it, I wanted to help people with it, but whenever I did, I would end up shaking by the end. And then gradually, through many healing things that I did, that lifted, and I could talk about it and teach about it without getting so triggered. But it's been a whole, a whole process and commitment to my healing and a belief that I deserve help. And I've coached people who were able to survive very well and heal, and other people who never worked again because they were devastated, and especially if it was on top of childhood trauma that they had never dealt with, it just wrecked their lives. It really did. It didn't, it was very sad.
Sometimes I have people say, "Oh, I can't believe you have a full-time job working on conflict. I've never had any problems." And I think, "I'm so happy for you." And for those people who just really haven't, just run-of-the-mill, people issues, but no real problems or haven't really witnessed it, it really is hard to explain the absolute devastation that bullying, gaslighting, mobbing, these toxic work environments can have on people's physical health, their mental health, and we know sometimes it causes death to people.
Yes, I talk about that the ultimate outcome of bullying and mobbing is death. Sometimes suicide, sometimes homicide, because some of the people who did the school shootings, etc., they were bullied first at school, and that's not a justification,
No.
but it just explains some of the background of. And I have one of the things I wrote about in my memoir. Uh, Angels and Earthworms, it's called, was I had this moment, one of the many, many egregious things had happened, and I was so mad I couldn't even see straight. And I walked out of my office into the lobby, and I wanted with my energy to burn the entire place down in that moment. Because I felt so powerless and so enraged. And it was just a fleeting moment, and it's terrifying. It was like, "Wow, what was that?" And that's when I knew I had to do more forgiveness work. I had to do more to get out of there, because I didn't want my heart to shatter in a million bitter pieces. So that was, but that, those feelings can be very deep and very big.
Yeah, absolutely. And going into the space that you do now with this, with helping people deal with what's going on with them and the different services you offer, going through that work yourself obviously makes you a better mediator, coach, and all the services that you offer. Because I think sometimes when people have had negative experiences at work, they end up thinking the way to solve the next person's problem is the way I solved it, or there
Yeah.
is no solving it because there was no solving it for me, instead of being able to look at our own trauma, the things that have happened to us, and deal with that, but in a way, compartmentalize it to be that neutral, to be able to be with people that, because sometimes in a mediation, you feel that you don't resonate with one of the parties, right? And yet
Mhm.
you're not there judging them. You are there making the space so that they can come together, right? And so
Right.
how you
Right.
de-escalate yourself from their own past hurts.
Yeah, well, one thing I have 2 things I want to say about that. One is I don't ever refer to myself as a neutral. I am not neutral.
Mm,
I am passionately committed to helping them talk to each other.
mm.
And, but I do put aside my own because it's not about me. It's about that they have a miscommunication or misunderstanding, or they're telling stories about each other, because we all tell stories about ourselves and each other that aren't the truth, because none of us have access to the truth. And so my commitment is to help them see that they're having parallel truths and stories and find common ground. And, I have taught a lot of people who were mostly HR people and managers and professionals who have to deal with conflict a lot.
Yeah.
And one of the things I tell them is you have to do your own work, because for other people, you can go a little bit beyond where you are. Because it's easier to see things about other people than about ourselves, but only a little bit. So if you don't deal with your own fears and about conflict, if you don't see yourself clearly and who you and conflict are, then it's really hard to help other people.
Yeah, absolutely. To get out of the way, to make the way for
Yes,
them, to clear the path for them. I was doing a training yesterday, and one of the questions was I asked this group, and they were broken into groups. How much of your day, your week, do you spend dealing with conflicts? A bunch of managers. And one person, these two people were talking. One person said, "Oh, I don't really have anything," and the other person said, "It's 70% of my day." And so these people who are in HR roles or particular management roles, depending on what kind of organization they're in, they are constantly dealing with this. And yet,
absolutely.
and yet a lot of times they aren't properly trained. They get that.
Exactly. That's my mission. Yeah, because I know I include when I'm giving my pitch, like my intro pitch of why does everyone in HR and leaders, need to have training with conflict? And I give them statistics about how much of HR people at least 1 day a week. I mean, as you said, it varies with the company. Managers, it can be 50% of their time, and just regular, team leaders and just regular working people without particular leadership responsibilities. Their time can be caught up with toxic conflict. And a lot of times it's pretty simple once you understand to be able to fix it. This is funny, but I read this Dear Abby story, right? It was just recently. It was about a family situation, and this mother had written in about her son and his fiance, and it was the most. I wrote an article about it called "How to Make Every Mistake in a Conflict." They had made like four classic conflict mistakes that can really be fixed easily if you can step outside the drama trauma and have a more nuanced sense of my story, their story, where did we each go wrong? So even though it was about, I thought, should I use it because it's about a family? And I thought, no, this applies to the workplace too. So I wrote about it. It just dropped yesterday.
Wonderful. In fact, speaking of articles, you wrote an article, and this is the one I found you through, about people who are going into business with one another and setting up the conditions so that when people start a new venture, a relationship, or anything at work, it's that honeymoon phase. Even like you talked about, oh, you've landed this wonderful job, everything. And so we just assume that other people will quote unquote act professionally, that there aren't going to be any personal or personnel issues, which is completely unreasonable because we're human persons and we are going to butt heads every once in a while. And if depending on who we are, if we don't have a path forward, it can escalate and and turn toxic, or especially when it can really sour relationships. So what
Right.
advice do you have for people when they are starting a venture, whatever kind of venture it is, to not conflict proof, because that's not the goal, but to put in place a plan so that when conflicts happen, they're managed early, often, swiftly, and justly?
Right. Well, it depends on the particular venture and the people, of course. But the first thing I tell everyone is that conflict happens. Conflict is a normal and frequent part of human interactions. When you have a group, when you have people, you're not going to see things exactly alike. You're going to butt heads at times, most likely, sooner or later. So accept that. That's the first thing, because when people have this, rosy idea that there's, "Oh, I love this person, we're going into business, it's all gonna be fun and games and rose petals," and, then they're setting themselves up for trouble. So just that acknowledgement, that understanding that conflict doesn't mean they're bad or the other person's bad, it just means they see things differently. And that, one of the things I talk about is that, well, there's uh, there's some teachings about how there's a good kind of conflict and a bad kind of conflict. The bad kind is personality conflict and pointing fingers and calling names. And the good kind of conflict is that tension that comes from having a shared goal, but having very, very different ideas about how to get there. So that basic understanding helps people have the right frame of mind. And then if they're going into a business partnership, one of the things, or a venture, is what do we do, is to talk about what do we do when we don't agree. So set up, can we sit down and meet about it? All of those kinds of things. Of There has to be a process and a commitment to communicate instead of running with judgments or beliefs that this person is the enemy.
Yeah.
So that's like my basic advice.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And whether you're starting a business or you're the leader of a team, you know, having those conversations, right? We are going to disagree. What should we do? This is how I
Right,
like to be talked to. How do you want to be talked to?
exactly.
And
And curiosity and
yeah,
listening. Instead of, there's a book I love called How to, oh gosh, my book brain isn't quite working at Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most. It's a classic. But one of the things they talk about is shifting from blame to contribution. So instead of blaming the other person or blaming yourself, you shift to, well, what have I contributed to this situation? What have you contributed? And the whole listening plus curiosity of, well, they're not my enemy. They weren't doing this to me for the most part. I mean, there's narcissists and
yeah,
bullies, but in general, most people aren't trying to do something to you. So if you could say, I wonder what they were thinking about this, or what was their truth or their story. And when both people are doing that, I mean, it's amazing what you can work out. Would you like an example?
absolutely. Please.
Yeah. Well, I was hired by this, it was actually a big credit union, to work with some of their high level C-suite people. And I worked with a VP and a manager who reported to the VP. And the way I work, I will never sit down with people and just do a mediation, because I find they've got a lot of feelings, they've got a lot of stories, they need to get support and share those, and separately. And then ever so gently, I start moving them towards, so how do you think the other person might see it? Or, well, have you thought about this as an alternative story, kind of thing? So there were a number of issues with these two women. And one of the things I checked out, just because one of the women was Black. And so I wanted to see if she felt like there was racism going on, and stay alert to see if I thought there was. And it turned out not to be a big issue, but it helped me build rapport with the woman who was African American, because she knew I was willing to go there with her and look at that as an issue. And what it came down to was the vice president was so protective of this woman as a manager that she would just assume she didn't have time or energy to do certain things and wouldn't even talk to her about them. And so I said, well, did you ask her if she wanted to do that, or if that, what she thought of that? And she said, no. And then with the woman who was the manager, she had a particular style of management. She was a very effective manager, but it was different from the vice president's style. And she expected the vice president to be the same kind of manager she was. And what it meant, what she was expecting her to read her mind about what she wanted and needed. And I said, well, did you talk to her about how you see things and what you need? And she said, no. And you know what? With those 2, I never actually met with the 2 of them together because they didn't need me. Those inner realizations of what their share was and what was going on were enough for them to have a very different conversation with each other and work things out, and happy endings all around.
We can just so get, as you talked about before, get trapped in our own story. We have a narrative and it's reasonable to us, and we're reasonable people. And we have somebody else that we've decided they're acting unreasonable. And so the problem is always them. They're not doing what
Yes.
they ought to be doing. And very rarely do we ask that very simple question. What are they telling their best friend about this circumstance? Do they know they're a villain? Is that what they're telling themselves, right? Do they think they are unreasonable? Would they think I'm unreasonable? And that stop, that pause of that curiosity, maybe I could ask them, you know?
Yes,
Or or as you said before, this happens, so much of conflict is miscommunication in one way or the other. I mean, that's not the only thing, but that is a lot
it's
of
a big
it.
one.
It's a big one. And what I've found is sometimes managers or just colleagues, out of a desire to protect and respect, they won't tell somebody something. I'll take that off. I'll do this. They don't need to know about it. Well, the other person feels disrespected because they don't know what's going on, right?
Right.
And so it's this, you don't trust me. I respect you so much. I don't want to burden you. And so when we can get them to, you know, talk and see and think and really understand what's going on, it does clear a lot.
Oh, yes. And in my teaching, I have come to spend a lot of time on story and the power of story and the ways we can shift our stories. I actually have this slide that shows Laura, I think it's Hardy, of Laurel and Hardy. There's a line in one of the movies that a friend of mine used to say, which is, "That's my story and I'm stuck with it." So then I put I have the photo in the bubble of him saying that, and then I put another thing that says, "False, false, we're not stuck with these stories." And I tell them a story of when I had a, really wild compared to what was the true story of what had happened with a client. And do you want to hear that one?
Please, yes.
Okay. So this was a new client. She was a manager who wanted to improve her communication skills. It was the first session. I was still kind of a little bit new, so I'd forgotten to invoice her ahead of time, which I usually do on, individual clients. I have them pay ahead, but I'd forgotten. So about 10 minutes, it seemed like it was going well. And about 10 minutes before the session's supposed to end, all of a sudden she's gone, disappears. So I thought it was a tech issue, and I waited to see if she would come back, and nothing. Tried to call her, couldn't get through, and then I emailed her the next day, and all this, didn't hear from her, and I got a real head of steam of like, here she's wanting to be a better manager and communicator, and she ghosted me. How could she do this? And how rude! And she didn't pay me, and I was really upset. And finally, I invoiced her one more time. Wrote her one more time invoice, and then I thought, well, just chalk it up to whatever. I didn't think I was doing a bad job. I don't know. So a month later, I heard from her that at the moment she'd been on the Zoom call with me, a tree had fallen on her house
Oh my
and
gosh.
destroyed part of the roof, knocked out the electricity. She had to move out because it was uninhabitable. I mean, I was so glad she was okay and everything, but then I started laughing so hard because I thought, even if I never get paid in money, I have been richly rewarded, because what a beautiful example of the story I was telling being so very different from reality.
That is such a great example because I was right there with you. I mean, that's a reasonable narrative. Because we know that happens, because it has probably never happened to you before that a client had a tree fall in their house and right? I was talking to somebody once that said that in order to help them change their narrative, they play a game and now them and their spouse do this when they're in the car and somebody is what we would typically say acting rudely in another car, so cutting them off or whatever, that they decide to make up good stories about that person. Oh, they must be off to the hospital with their pregnant
Yes.
wife, or
Yes.
oh, they must be curing can't, to challenge that we almost many times we give this negative story.
Exactly. And I teach a workshop on hot buttons, emotional triggers, and I with help from other experts, I came up with these 5 steps that you can go through. And one of them, it's becoming conscious of the story you're telling. And is it true? Do you know it's true? Are you sure it's true? Kind of thing. And what story might they be telling as part of it? And then I also ask them to make up a better story. And I say, imagine, invent, ask, whatever. And so I have them do a thing where they do exactly what you were talking about of coming up with and I use that all the time. It really helps me when I notice I'm starting to it's like, well, maybe, la la la.
That's right. Because, it's interesting, while most of us just sort of default to that, right? But we certainly don't want anybody else to think about our intentions that way, right? Because we know we have good intentions and we know even if we make a mistake, we weren't trying to. And
Exactly.
we know this about ourselves. And yet there's this curious thing where we just tend to, I don't want to impugn everybody who's out there listening, but we tend to not extend that grace to others, the grace that we
Exactly.
want extended to ourselves.
It's true, and I have slides that when I teach this, it's like we judge ourselves by our intentions, and we judge others by the impact it has on us, and interpret that as being bad intentions because of the impact it had. But it's really not right to judge ourselves by intentions and other people by impact, because if something cut you to the quick, it doesn't mean someone meant to do that. As I said, there are people who do mean to do that, but
Yeah.
they're a smaller minority than you would think from watching the news.
So, Lorraine, with all that you have learned and what you do now, if you were to be transported back to this difficult, toxic environment that you were in 2 years in, what is there anything that you would have done differently that would have made a difference? I mean, sometimes organizational structures are just such that at that time there isn't anything that can be done. So, what advice would you give your young professor self?
Well, I've thought about this a lot because I certainly know more about conflict management and bullying and mobbing than I knew then. Um, what I've concluded in general is that I would have ended up in the same place no matter what, because it was so toxic, so oppositional to true good teaching, education, honoring people who come from different traditions or whatever, who have something to contribute. It was so embedded, the toxicity in this organization, that I would always have ended up in trouble.
Mhm.
It's just gonna it would have been I mean, there definitely were certain situations that if I had understood more, I could have handled a lot better of really knowing how to separate what I thought was going on from what their stories were. Um, but, you know, I think what I would tell you, I would have said, "Look for another job."
Yeah. And that is really good advice because
Yeah,
we have to be concerned with our physical and mental health. And yet, I can imagine somebody saying, "Well, why did you stay so long?" But you also said it wasn't always like that. Like why does the battered person stay in that relationship? Because it isn't always like that. And
exactly.
there's this good, and maybe I'm protecting this person, or you were advocating for this group of students, and you saw the good, and there is all this sunshine, and yet the darkness
Yeah,
comes. And that's why people stay is because of the good parts,
yeah.
but because of the protection.
And also, I tried I was an exploited adjunct worker for 8 years.
Mhm.
I mean, I wanted that tenure so bad, and it was still one of the hardest things I've ever done to walk away from tenure. Job security, summers off, full benefits, and it was easy to talk, to lie to myself. Well,
Mhm.
it's not so bad. Well, now it's okay, and, yeah. I wish I had been able I was so afraid to leave. And, I just have to be grateful for everything I learned. And it's been 15 years
Mm.
now since I left, and hallelujah for everyone. And I wasn't that young, but I was able to create a new career for myself and have enough money to live on and everything. And so, to people who feel really stuck, I want to say transformation is always possible.
Absolutely. Yeah, certainly at mid-age. So I taught philosophy for over 20 years and I
Oh,
left about 3 years ago to start my own business. We can always transform and change. And I hope nobody hears, and it's as easy as pie. It's not, but it's also it's not easy to stay in a difficult situation or stay in a place where you know you should be doing something else. And so
right.
we got to pick our hard and there are lots of options out there.
And I wanna say it's something that I talk about and I believe in, which is love, the role of love in resolving conflict and self-love,
Yeah.
that all of us deserve to be in a working environment, that, honors us, that allows us to share our gifts with the world, and it can start with us, of believing we deserve that, and, that we don't no one deserves to be abused, and to protect yourself however you can, and so you're not being an abuser, because it's easy to become an abuser to yourself as well. But by getting support, by using spiritual, practical, and emotional tools, it's possible to gather that inner strength to make a change, to take a risk. It takes courage, but as both of us know, I think it's so worth it.
And I think when we look at our lives, we think about what is a life well lived? Like this is my life. What is it that I want to do with it? What is important to me? And I think a lot of times in our culture, we just have there are fewer and fewer places to ask those kinds of questions, to have quiet, to be able to think about what is it that I really want
Mhm.
in this life. And if we just get pulled along by the hurriedness, there's lots of bustle, bustle, bustle. Our culture is very uncomfortable with
Grind.
silence and very wants us to be super, super busy. So that what do we do with those uncomfortable questions? Well, what is it that I want? And many times those aren't ready answers. And it's the thing is, it's not the same for everybody, right? So what brings me happiness and peace and harmony may be different from somebody else. But
Yes.
if we start to really think about what who what do I want? What is the good life? What does that look like for me? And really think about what does that look like in my professional and my private life? What am I doing? And I think asking those questions when somebody is in, I think, a boundary situation, these life altering situations when things are going really wrong, either in our personal or our professional life, it's, it sounds terrible to say when you're in it, but it is an opportunity to
It
really
is.
wake up and say, come on, Mary, what do
Mhm.
you want? What are you going to do next? And
Yes.
it's not easy, but what else is there?
I, can I read you the very last paragraphs of my memoir is about my journey to loving myself, to finding right livelihood, to finding true love too. And, I at the very end, I talk about how being of service is the deepest joy, of how much joy I have in doing that. And, the very last paragraph is, "We are all miracles. I always have hope and support and love and purpose and a beautiful sustaining path forward. I cannot control what happens next, but one day at a time, I can live a life beyond my wildest imaginings. Not a fantasy of perfection, but a real, beautiful, imperfect life filled with challenges, joy, love, satisfaction, angels, earthworms, and wonder. I wish that for all of you, dear readers. I truly am a miracle, and you are too.
Oh, I love that so much. Please check out Lorraine's book, Earth. Could you tell us the full name of your book?
It's Angels and Earthworms, An Unexpected Journey to Joy, Love, and Miracles. And I have information about how to get it on my website, conflictremedy.com.
That's
Yeah,
wonderful. I
because
love
it really was, walking through the darkness, walking
yeah,
through, and some of it was inner stuff. It had nothing to do with that job,
yeah.
and some of it was from that job. But when I think about it, I'm just filled with tears and joy.
I love that you use the word imperfection, right? So when we think about what is it that we want out of life, if we want something that's perfect, well, it's not reasonable and you're not going to be
Right.
able to attain it. And so you're going to be searching for the wrong things and you're not going to be able to get it in the first place. But in realizing that what is the good life is is warts and all, but it's the beauty, it's going through the mundane and accepting that there are hard times and accepting the wonder and that we all deserve to have love and to be loved and and to act in, I believe, in principles according to love. Augustine says love and do what you will, and that is at base my ethic. Love and do what you will, because if you're acting out of love doesn't mean you're going to be perfect, but you can reflect and realign your intentions and so that your intentions and your actions become
Mhm.
synchronized.
And it really does self-love is really important. I don't think our culture it's not the same as, being full of yourself. It's
No.
it's it's that idea of, well, in my own spiritual practice, it's the goddess says to me, "You are a spark of my divine flame." So we have that spark of the divine that connects us to greater, and every single person we meet has that spark. And the goal is to try to meet spark to spark.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, if we're going to move forward in our work environments and have healthier work environments, the humanity has to be returned, right? So we don't want to be treated as objects or cogs in the machine. We want to be treated as persons. And I mean, it is the golden rule. Then treat others as persons that are unique and messy, have wonderful days, and are competent and have bad days, just like us. And that
Mhm.
doesn't mean lack of responsibility. It means we are responsible ultimately for one another in the sense that we ought to treat people well and then expect to be treated well and not expect less for ourselves.
Yes. I
Absolutely.
I love what you said about mistakes, especially, I used to teach immigrants English as a second language, and I started talking to them the first day of class about mistakes. So I would say to them, "Let's talk for a minute about mistakes," in their eyes. They'd never had a teacher say it, just talk about mistakes in general. I would say, "You could sit in class all semester and not open your mouth and say anything and not write anything down, and you wouldn't make any mistakes." And their eyes would even get bigger. And I'd say, "But do you think that would be the best use of your time? Do you think you would be learning and growing and getting everything you could out of the class?" And they'd say, "No." And I said, "That's because humans make mistakes. I make mistakes every day, many of them. I expect you to make mistakes too."
Gosh, I love that so much because when I think about why do people not have these difficult conversations, largely because they're afraid in one way or another, but they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. They don't know what to
Mhm,
say. And so then we
mhm,
just don't. And it usually compounds and makes it work. And so having that space of, I care enough about you and myself that I'm willing to get it wrong. I'm willing
mhm.
to be misunderstood because I want to understand. And I don't want to live in the past, the tapes that I'm playing. I want to move forward. But
Yes.
it is that I love, be recognizing that I do this as a living and I get stuff wrong in my personal life, in my professional life, and it stings because I care so much. Oh, well, keep on going and learning and admit and press forward for the goal, right? What is the goal? To love your neighbor and to love yourself,
Yes.
right?
And, you know, when I talk about, uh, listening and, conversations, difficult conversations, and of course, one of the tools is paraphrasing or, reflecting back to someone what they said. And I always tell them, if you get it wrong, it still works because then they have a chance to say, "No, that's not what I meant," but they still feel like you're paying attention and you're listening to them, and it's a beautiful example of how you can make a mistake and still get it right.
Yeah, that is wonderful. So, Lorraine, our time is drawing short. And my last question I'd like to ask is when you look into the future of work, what do you think needs to happen so that not only are people treated with dignity and respect, that's just baseline, but we want more than that. We want people to thrive and flourish at work. So, what do you think needs to happen?
Oh, well, how much time do we have now? Um, one thing that has become increasingly important to me, and I know for lots of younger workers as well, is that work-life balance.
Mm,
I mean, I think that the goal for to have effective, harmonious, well-functioning, innovative workplaces, there has to be a respect and recognition of the need for downtime, the need for people to not be thinking about work and being workaholics and obsessed with their value being only from work. So that's one thing. And I think, you know, having a I mean, we've been talking about this the whole time, but that basic understanding of what everyone does is valuable, that everyone is contributing and can have great ideas that you would miss if
yeah,
you reject them because they have brown skin or they're too young or whatever it is. And so that feeling that we're all in this together, trying to create a beautiful product or create a beautiful service. And I think that managers and HR people, there's some now who are really well trained and really get this stuff, but there's still it's so uneven of who knows this stuff and who doesn't. And I think making that a criteria for people to be a CEO, for people to be a manager, for people to be a VP, that they have these conflict skills, that they have this compassion and understanding, and a lot of it is perfectly teachable. And there are more corporations who are recognizing that it does help the bottom line, even if they only care about the bottom line, and a lot of them care about other things too.
right.
So that kind of vision where everyone's contributing, everyone's in it together, everyone's ideas count. There's and also you have to have structures in place to deal with conflict when it comes up. There
Mhm.
can't just be one person to talk to. Ombuds are a great idea. Having, training just individuals who can help intervene with colleagues. If everyone has the mindset that we're going to work this out and we have skills to do it, it could transform what it's like to be at work.
Absolutely. Gosh, I love everything you just said. Thank you so much for being on Conflict Managed. It was just a delight to meet you and chat with you.
Oh, it was such a pleasure to talk with someone as knowledgeable and kind as yourself. So
Oh, thank you.
thank you very much.
Well, take care. Thank you for joining us on Conflict Managed. Conflict Managed is produced by Third Party Workplace Conflict Restoration Services and hosted by me, Mary Brown. Hope to see you again soon. And remember, conflict is normal and expected at work. So let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.